I will start by giving you a very simple definition of suffering. It means having what you don't want or wanting what you don't have. And I think that that covers everything. From the most trivial thing, like breaking a fingernail, which none of us women enjoy doing, to something devastating in your life. And of course, I don't know who you are this morning. I don't know what your sorrows and sufferings may be, but the Lord knows. And a little while ago, we heard that song that says, whatever it takes. And God alone knows what it takes to enable you and me to be conformed to the image of Christ. We have our own plans and purposes, our own desires and hopes, and we would like the Lord to be a little bit more lenient on us at times. And we're forever asking that three-letter word question, why? So for those of you who have notebooks, and I'm always thrilled when I see somebody busily writing away. Of course, they might be catching up on their correspondence for all I know, but it's always nice to think that maybe somebody wants to preserve something that they've heard. The title for this morning's talk is The Great Why. That three-letter word, why. The world is determined to avoid pain at all costs. We live in the richest country in the world, the most wonderful country in the world. Certainly, we have advantages which are far and away beyond almost any other country. And we are addicted to fun and comfort. Don't you think so? We're glad to serve the Lord as long as it's going to be fun and comfortable. But invade our comfort zone, we don't want anybody to do that. The world is determined to avoid pain at all costs. And it is considered the greatest of all evils. This is a refusal to recognize the value of suffering and pain. It's a trainer of character. It means that we must cultivate a deeper awareness and understanding. And on the opposite extreme, we have some people who think that suffering should be glorified as good in itself. I don't think that suffering is good in itself, but it is an instrument, and it can be used in God's hands for the blessing and the shaping of many of us. And I would say that if you were to think back over the people who have had the deepest influence in your spiritual life, you would find that without exception, they are people who have suffered. And I could tell you many stories about the people who have had the deepest influence in my own life. And there has certainly been no exception. Every single one of them has suffered, I would say, deeply, not superficially at all. There are those Christians who would even say that to attempt to alleviate suffering is immoral. Well, Jesus did not avoid suffering, but he healed many people, didn't he? And he called his disciples to do three things. He said, if you want to be my disciple, you must give up your right to yourself. Now, may I see the hands of those of you who find that easy? I have no doubt that it is the most difficult thing that God asks of you and me. And he put it right up front. Do you want to be my disciple? Then you must give up your right to yourself. Deny thyself. And the second thing is to take up the cross. What can the cross possibly mean except suffering? The cross was an instrument of torture in Jesus' day. So he asks all of us, secondly, to take up the cross, and third, just follow. Put one foot in front of the other. About 40 years ago, I was squatting around an Indian fire in the home of a very sweet, newly baptized Christian couple, Quechua Indians. And the light was very dim because it was just a little bit of firelight. And the mother sat there cradling her tiny newborn baby. My daughter was with me. She was about 2 years old at the time. And the mother and the father were convinced that this baby was going to die. I couldn't see anything wrong with the baby, but they began to tell me that before the mother had become a Christian, she had been cursed by a witch doctor many years before. In fact, she was probably just a child or a teenager at the time. And the witch doctor cursed her and told her that she would never be able to produce a child. So it was, of course, a great concern in their minds when they became Christians. They then, of course, came to my husband Jim and me and said, "Can God reverse a curse?" And we assured her that he could. And so she trusted him for that. And the baby was born. But the baby died by the next day or so. I've forgotten exactly when it was. And I was there in the process. I still couldn't see a thing wrong with that baby. And of course, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, but I'd had a little bit of experience with being a rather well-known quack in the jungle. You know, if you're somebody with clean hands and common sense, why people come and start asking you to help them. But I could not see a thing wrong, and I kept saying to them, "I think the baby's all right." And they kept saying, "Senora, he is dying." And before our eyes, he died. Certainly one of those times when one would just want to cry to God and say, "Why? Here are these new Christians. They believed your word that you can save this child, that you can enable her to conceive. And then you gave her this child and took him back." Does the Lord answer our questions? Sometimes he does. Sometimes he doesn't. And when he doesn't give us any other answer, he's constantly saying to you and me, "Trust me. I know what I'm doing. I've got the whole world in my hands." It's not just this world, but just think of the galaxies. He's got the whole world in his hands. So for you note takers, I will give you 3 points. Number 1, we need to suffer. We need to suffer. Someone wrote, "Were it not for suffering, millions of human beings would never develop an atom of affection. It is folly to conclude that a thing ought not to be because it hurts." And let me pause right there and remind you, you parents, that you have to discipline your children, don't you? And you may say to your child, as you raise the rod or whatever you use for that discipline, "This hurts me worse than it hurts you." Now, what child ever believes that? I can remember my parents saying that, and I didn't believe a word of it. But of course, the moment that I was in that position of being the mother and having to discipline my child, I knew the truth of it. It is folly to conclude that a thing ought not to be because it hurts. There are powers to be born, creations to be perfected, sinners to be redeemed, all through the ministry of pain. Redeemed, perfected, and born in no other way. There are powers to be born, creations to be perfected, and sinners to be redeemed, all through the ministry of pain, that could not be born, perfected, and redeemed in any other way. Jesus said, "Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." And it's those great saints of God who have literally died to themselves, given up their right to themselves, who have produced the fruit, the wheat. And perhaps some of you have forgotten the context in which Jesus said those words, But he had just raised Lazarus, and then he had been hailed with palm branches and hosannas. And some of the disciples came to Jesus and said, there are some Greeks here who would like to meet you. They had heard about the raising of Lazarus, and of course, who wouldn't want to meet somebody who had raised the dead? And so this was going to be a glorious thing. And Jesus brought the disciples right down to earth when he said, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. In other words, he was saying, I'm going to tell you what real glory is. It's death. Because if it dies, then it brings forth much fruit. And how many pastors and speakers have referred to the death of the 5 American missionaries back in 1956 and used that very passage. Some have entitled it 5 grains of wheat. They, in a sense, fell into the ground and died, but out of their death has come fruit which is beyond counting. And I really don't think there's a week anyway, I don't want to exaggerate, but I doubt that there's a week that goes by that Lars and I don't hear from someone whose life has been changed because of the testimony of those 5 men. There are powers to be born in your children, creations to be perfected, and sinners to be redeemed. And so you parents have the solemn and holy responsibility of making your child suffer. You have to do it, don't you? We need to suffer. The child needs to suffer, and the parent has to suffer in administering the pain. And Paul said, if we suffer with him, we shall also reign with him. And he said, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I've done a lot of thinking about the way we question God, especially when it comes to suffering. We ask this question constantly, don't we? Why? Why, Lord, did I have to go through this? And the Lord's answer is, this is what it takes. Did you ever say to him, whatever it takes for my will to break, that's what I'm willing to do? It's a pretty staggering affirmation, isn't it? Because you don't know what God's will is going to be. And I have young people ask me so often, how can I find the will of God? Of course, I tell them 3 very simple things to start with. Number 1, tell God that you'll do anything he says. And they come back with the question, well, how in the world am I going to tell God I'll do anything he says if I don't know what he's going to say? Well, that's where trust comes in. Do you think God is trustworthy? Is he going to say anything that would not be good for you? You have to begin by telling God, before you know what he's going to say, I'm available, Lord. As Mary said, behold the handmaiden of the Lord. Let it happen as you say. Or be it unto me according to thy word. And so we ask God all these questions. And I've wondered sometimes if the truth is that we're really not willing to understand. We're not willing to rearrange our lives. And ironically, there are times when we are really not willing to be healed. Do you remember the strange question that Jesus asked the man at the pool of Bethesda? He'd been there 38 years, helpless. And Jesus said to him, do you want to be healed? What an odd question to ask a man in a situation like that. But Jesus knew human nature. And he knew that there is a certain kind of selfishness which treasures the attention of being ill. And of course, the man, instead of saying yes, he began to give Jesus a list of excuses as to why he was still in this condition, explaining things to God. And are you willing to lose your life? Further question, do you want solutions or do you want holiness? Ask yourself that question. Lord, I need an answer to this. I have to know why you've done this to me. He's not going to solve the problem necessarily, because there's something much more important than that in God's economy, which is to make us holy. Do we want safety or do we want to know Christ? And the pastor was telling me as we were driving here this morning that he had begun to pray that he might know Christ. And God did a work in his life which he didn't have any idea that he needed before then. Safety, of course, is something that we're very concerned with in the United States, what with airbags and seat belts and recalled children's toys and car parts and whatnot. It's just endless, as if we are somehow going to create a totally no-risk society. Well, there is no such thing as a no-risk discipleship. Jesus is asking us to follow him. Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of our life's wild, restless sea. Day by day, his sweet voice soundeth, saying, Christian, follow me. Where do you think he's going to take you? Of course, we have no way of knowing, do we? It's not our business to be asking God where he's going to take us or what he's going to do with us. But I want to read to you a little poem from Amy Carmichael. It should comfort you if you're scared about what God might be asking of you. She starts with Psalm 56:3 that says, Nevertheless, although I am sometimes afraid, yet put I my trust in thee. And it's perfectly human, it's perfectly natural for us to be afraid. But what time I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. And that is a willed action. Fear is an emotion. Remember that God has created us with two modalities, two different functions in our lives. One is emotion and one is will. And we can't by any means always control our emotions. We can't always feel good when we wish we could feel good, but we can will to do God's will. And so the psalmist had said, Nevertheless, though I'm sometimes afraid, that's fear, which is an emotion, I put my trust. And that is a deliberate, willed act. And there's undoubtedly more than one person sitting here this morning that needs to do exactly that. You're very afraid of what tomorrow might hold, or what somebody might do to you, or what the doctor is going to tell you the next time you go to his office. That's perfectly normal and natural. But we don't have to behave according to our fears. We have to make a willed, deliberate choice. Lord, I am going to trust you. What time I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. So this is her poem. Never will I ask of thee more than thou canst do. Ever I will be with thee, Savior, Shepherd too. Never shall go forth from me a command too hard for thee. How many times have we said, Lord, I can't do that? Remember what Paul said, I can do all things all by myself? No. Through Christ who strengthens me. I was asked one time to speak to a group of pastors' wives. I think there were 150 of them for a luncheon. And so I called my daughter because I've never been a pastor's wife. My daughter is one. So I said, Valerie, what would you say to them? And without any hesitation, she said to me on the phone, you just tell them to give and give and give and don't expect anything in return. And I said, well, I'll tell them that that's what you said. But I said, they're going to tell me, I can't do that. And she said, well, just remind them I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The second stanza of Amy Carmichael's poem says, "Trust me then, O child of mine. Faith knows not to fear. Thou art mine, and I am thine. I am always near. Near to be thy strong defense, quietness, and confidence." Point 2, a definition. Now, I've already given you the very simplest one that I know, having what you don't want or wanting what you don't have. But a definition of the word itself, suffering, means to submit to. To suffer means to submit to be forced, to endure. We could think of cancer as certainly something that you have to submit to. You're going to submit also to the surgeon's knife and the chemotherapy and the radio, whatever it is, all the things that they're going to do to you. You willingly submit to that person and to his advice because you think he knows more about it than you do, and it is your only choice. But we have to suffer all kinds of things from all sorts of people that we do not willingly suffer. Bereavement. There's nothing we can do to change the fact that our child or our husband or our closest friend is dead. We suffer that. False charges. We have friends, dear, sweet Christian family. The husband received a notice that he was being charged with sexual abuse. Turned out that the woman who was charging him had simply taken his license plate number in a mall. And did you know that you can find anybody's name and address from their license plate? And so she had accused this man. Of course, he didn't have the foggiest idea who she was or how she could possibly have accused him of any such thing. And they had to go to court, and it cost them $4,000 to prove his innocence. False charges. Terrible things are happening. I hear about parents who are suddenly called by their adult children and told, "You abused me as a child," and they find out that the child has been going to some psychologist that supposedly rakes up things. Hatred, a wayward child, a handicapped child, the loss of a child, a parent, a friend, or a spouse. We could go on and on about the things that we have to suffer, submit to, be forced to endure. But the Lord is there to help us. He has created a path through suffering. And there is absolutely nothing that is going to happen to us without his permission. And then we're back to that 3-letter word again. But why does he give permission for things like this? Because he is shaping us, ladies and gentlemen, into the image of Christ. What does it take for a sculptor to shape an image? Michelangelo made it sound very simple. He said you just take a block of marble and you knock off everything that doesn't look like David. That sounds very simple, doesn't it? But it does take the blows of a hammer, the chippings of a chisel, and the raspings of a file. And that's what it takes for you and me, figuratively. There will be hammer blows, and some of you have just experienced them quite recently. Then there are the chippings of the chisel, not nearly as painful as the hammer blows, but painful nevertheless. And then the rasping of the file. Maybe you have to work with somebody here in this church or in your job, or you have to put up with somebody who's a neighbor. Just irritating little things. But the Lord is smoothing off those sharp edges and those sharp corners in this process. Grief, disappointment, neighbors, co-workers, singleness, marriage. You know, I get hundreds of letters from single women who are desperate to get married, and they're absolutely convinced that God is withholding from them the one thing that would make them truly happy. And of course, we married women could tell them a couple of things. Marriage is a wonderful thing. And as I told you, I never even dreamed that I would have the first one, let alone the second. And he died of cancer. And as you could see, Lars looks pretty healthy today. At least as far as I know, he still is. But something happens about 24 hours after the wedding. And all sorts of things that you didn't know about that wonderful person. You may have to suffer in some small way, some revelation that you didn't dream of. And I get a lot of letters from married women explaining to me how awful their situation is, and many of them really wanting me to give them permission to go ahead and get a divorce, which they're not going to get from Elisabeth Elliot. It's my job to stick with what this book says, not to be making up anything that's contrary to that. But probably the single people who are imagining marriage to be the be-all and the end-all of wonderful things, they're outnumbered by the letters that I get from women who wish they were not married. What are you suffering this morning? What are you having to submit to or to be forced to endure? It's not a matter of what the suffering is. What really is an indication of your trust in God is the way you respond. You know, suffering never made a saint out of anybody. It is the response that changes one's life. And Jesus, of course, demonstrated that over and over and over again. He suffered in many ways long before he had to go to the cross. Mary was told when her baby was only 8 days old that she was going to experience a sword which would pierce her heart. I have no doubt that Mary was pierced many times in the life of her son, Jesus. God's purpose is to redeem the world ultimately from pain. But that redemption entails our going through the valley of suffering. Remember what God's high and holy purpose is. It is to redeem the world ultimately from pain. But he was the one that had to do that, wasn't he? And he knew before the foundation of the world that he would be the lamb slain because of the iniquity of the perfect man and the perfect woman that had been created and put in the Garden of Eden. And of course, if they had not been the beginners of sin, I would have been, I'm sure. Probably you would admit that you would too. So that redemption entails our going through pain and suffering here. And I love what Gerald Vann says. Pain is part of a love story, part of the plot of a love story. Many of you would be able to testify that although you felt sure that you could never survive the thing that happened, you know now that you would not give anything for the lessons that you learned through that experience. It's part of the plot of a love story, and he loves us with an everlasting love. And underneath are the everlasting arms. That's what the Bible says. These marital problems that crop up, is it because we don't find our husbands compatible with our tastes and our desires and our preferences? Is it because we don't really want to submit to them? And remember that the dictionary definition for the word suffer is submit. And I'm sure that God knew exactly what he was doing when he said quite clearly and unequivocally, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Because your husbands are so much smarter than you are. Is that what it says? It doesn't say that. Or your husbands are more spiritual than you are. Or they're better looking, or they're taller, or they're stronger. They may be all of those things. But when he says submit to your husbands, he adds as to the Lord. And so we need to examine our response when something crosses our will and we find the Spirit of God whispering in our ear. Submit. That will simplify your life. Submit. Suffer this. Quietly, calmly, cheerfully. Just say, yes, dear, for a change. Try that. It might just do all kinds of wonderful things. But the marital problems come because we're sinners, don't they? And I have a sheaf of the most wonderfully encouraging letters from women who have written to tell me how God has transformed their marriages. I have a lot of the opposite, too. I don't save those. They're too depressing. But I do have a file which is just wonderfully encouraging to realize that there are those who have taken the simple way. Now, let's not confuse the word simple with the word easy, because things are not necessarily easy, but they are so simple. The Word of God is simple. Even when he says, if you want to be my disciple, give up your right to yourself. You know exactly what he means, but you don't want to do it. And that's what makes it complicated. That's why all the fuss. If you just simply decide that you're going to obey, even when it doesn't make any sense. And I get so many letters from women telling me about the unreasonable requirements that their husbands are making. And so they would like me to give them some kind of a fire escape, just some excuse, right, and say, well, you don't really have to do that. But I can't say that, can I? Because their response to their husband is supposed to be exactly what their response would be to Jesus Christ, because it is as to the Lord. And if you think that there's going to be a disastrous result of that submission, you can rest assured that you are still in the everlasting arms, and he is the one who is going to take care of you in what you may think is a disaster. A wonderful antidote for the whole question of marital difficulties is Colossians 3. We haven't got time to read the whole chapter today, but whenever I send a wedding present to young people who are about to be married, I always give them a part of Colossians 3. It says in verse 1, since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And one of the reasons our lives are so complicated is because our minds are set on things of the earth. So the Apostle Paul is telling us, raise your sights. Then here's the crucial part, I would think, in any marriage. Verse 9, do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's holy, chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And it pops into my mind as I read this list how those qualities are exhibited in this rescue mission that we've been seeing. You'd have to have all of those, wouldn't you? Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Verse 13 says, bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, write down these 3 words now, ladies. Put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, for you were called to peace, and be thankful. Point 3, does God rejoice in suffering? No, of course not. But yet there is a double answer here. God does not rejoice in suffering in itself. Definitely not. Because good cannot rejoice in evil as such. But as a means through which good may come, God rejoices. Now, to go back to an example that I've already referred to, the death of the 5 men was certainly a terrible thing. It was evil. It was sin on the parts of the Indians who did the spearing. But the good that has come out of that is incalculable. I don't have any hesitation to assume that at least 1,000 people who became missionaries through the testimony of those 5 men. Now, I don't have actual statistics now, but my mail over all these more than 40 years would certainly indicate that. And I had a letter not very long ago from a woman who was on a short-term mission program, and she said, I asked the other 19 people in the group what had galvanized them to become interested in missions. And she said every single one of them said the testimony of the 5 men in Ecuador. God doesn't rejoice in suffering as such, but as a means from which good will come, yes, he rejoices. Because he wills the good to come in the end. And we have no more shining scriptural example of that than the story of Joseph, who went through horrors, didn't he? His brothers had murder in their hearts, and then they decided to drop him into a pit. Then they discovered that they could sell him for money, and so they sold him to the Midianites, and he was taken into Egypt, into slavery, and he was put in a house where a woman lied about him. She was an adulterous woman, and as a result of that, he was put in prison. And for years and years, he lay there in prison, and it appears that God wasn't doing anything at all. And yet, what happened in the end? When he was talking to his brothers, when he was then prime minister of Egypt and in charge of the granaries, he said, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. The brothers' lives were saved, and his father's life was saved because Joseph was in charge of the granaries. So then he says, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And then in a later chapter, in chapter 50 of Genesis, he said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's how good comes out of evil. God is in the business of transforming all of us in all of our situations. When I think of old Gikita, he was the oldest man in the Auca tribe. He was probably 40 or 42 when he threw the first spear, which landed in one of the missionaries' backs. Well, I got to know Gikita, and I wasn't there when he actually accepted Jesus as his Savior, but he died about 1.5 years ago, a shining Christian. And I think of Minkayi, the joker of the Auca tribe. I got to know all 5 of the men who had actually done the spearing. And Minkayi was my favorite because he was such a funny man and so cheerful and outgoing and helpful in many ways. And Minkayi, too, became a Christian, as did the other 3. Jesus himself, the Bible tells us, learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Does God rejoice in suffering? Surely he rejoiced as he watched his own beloved Son learn obedience through suffering. There's a great mystery there, isn't there? One that we cannot possibly unpack. But Jesus said, the world must be shown that I love the Father and will do exactly what he says. That was just before he left his disciples, and he was preparing them for his absence. And the disciples were so afraid and so worried. And Jesus put it right on the line. He said, the prince of this world is coming, speaking of Satan, but he has no rights over me. And he has no rights over you and me, ladies and gentlemen. He has no rights over us. But through our suffering, the world must be shown that we love the Father and will do exactly what he says. That's what the world needs to be shown. We would not be qualified for that if we knew no suffering. He is qualifying us for heaven by putting us through the dark valleys of earth. Only through his suffering could the Father rejoice in him. And it is through our acceptance. And Amy Carmichael taught me that great lesson when I learned that my husband Jim was missing, or when I found that he was actually dead. First we knew that they were missing, and then it was 4 days before we knew whether the 5 men had all been killed. But the Lord brought to my mind then those wonderful words from Isaiah 43. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon you. For I am the Lord your God. Jesus said, whoever cares for his own safety is lost. But if we lose ourselves for his sake, he said, you will find your true self. We are so solicitous of our own safety and comfort, aren't we? Whoever cares for his own safety is lost. But he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. In what way is the Lord speaking to you this morning about losing your life? Maybe some little argument that has come up with somebody else, and you know you're in the right. How about just opening your hands and saying, Lord, here it is. I'm going to let you handle this. Whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. So the great why, just for a review. Number one, we need to suffer. Number two, the definition of suffering is to submit to be forced to endure. And number three, does God rejoice in suffering? There's a double answer, isn't there? And I hope I've made the reasons understandable. God bless you.